So welcome, to you all to our second tutorial of 2021. The speaker for our second tutorial is Professor Blase from University of Chicago, and he will teach us about authentication systems. Blase is a Neubayer Family Assistant Professor of Computer Science at the University of Chicago, and he directly uses Chicago's supergroup, which uses data-driven methods to make security and privacy usable. Blase is a prolific researcher who made multiple highly impactful contributions to the field of usability and system security and privacy. And I think just due to that reason, he has won a number of awards for his research. So just to list is like he won an ASF Career Award in 2021, 3 Best Paper Awards in CHI 2017, Using Security 2016, and UBCOM 2014, and 5 Honorable Mention Paper Awards in 5 editions of CHI. So today Blase is going to talk about securing state-of-the-art authentication systems and conduct hands-on exercises evaluating a prospective new authentication system. So without further ado, I request Blase to take the stage. And all of you, please join Slack in the channel. It's going to be exciting. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mainack, for that introduction. And you left out the fact that we got to work together very closely for a year. Mainack and I did when Mainack was a postdoctoral researcher at U Chicago back about almost 5 years ago. So yeah, I've had the pleasure of working with Mainack very closely over the years. Right. And so as Mainack said, what I'm going to be doing today is a tutorial on authentication systems. And what I figured I would do is I have a 3-hour slot. If I were to talk for 3 hours, you would be very upset with me, I'm sure. So what I figured I would do is spend about the first hour and a half doing kind of more of a presentation, but I want it to be very interactive. So please ask questions. You can ask questions. I have it's first thing in the morning for me here in Chicago in the United States. And so I'm at home. I have the chat window open. I have, actually, I'm going to open Slack before we go any further. Oops. All these different screens all over the place. So let me, so let me just make sure I'm in the right Slack. Yeah, so you can ask questions in Slack, in the Zoom chat, you can raise your hand, whatever works best for you works for me. Right, and here we are in space, and yeah, great. So I'm now in the right channel. Awesome. So kind of the way I structured this presentation is I'll start off talking a little bit about kind of how we think about evaluating authentication systems. Specifically, we'll talk about some frameworks that others have proposed that I think are really useful, and just like kind of how we think about attacks on authentication systems. Right, and then what I'll do is for the bulk of the presentation, kind of trace about 4 years of my own research in password authentication from a lot of different perspectives. And the reason I wanted to do this is to give you all, and my understanding is many of you in the tutorial are students, not everyone, but my understanding is there are a lot of students here. And so I think it'd be great, for you to see sort of kind of how I moved from project to project in kind of answering complementary research questions, right? And so then after that, what I'll do is talk kind of about a little bit more practical authentication and where I see authentication moving. And specifically, I'll give a little, quick overview of some work that I and my collaborators did on basically using biometrics to sign into websites with the WebAuthn protocol as part of the FIDO2 project. And then so that'll bring us to about an hour and a half. And at that point, we'll take a short break and then come back. And then what I've done is I've actually created a couple of different sets of password hashes. And what I'm going to have you do is you get to go basically, if you want to install password cracking software, actually, I'm going to recommend Hashcat at that point. And then you're going to try and crack some passwords, and we'll kind of talk about these strategies and everything there. So it'll be the second half of the tutorial will be very hands-on. And I think, there's a little part of my heart that just skips a beat every time I crack a password, and hopefully you'll actually have that experience as well. All right, great. So if there are any questions, I know Anupam Mondal just posted in Slack that if you have any questions for me, just post them here in the tutorial-2-authentication research and practice channel in Slack. Right, and so I have that open on my other screen, so I'll see it pretty immediately. All right, so if there are no questions, then let's just dive in. Right, so how do we authenticate broadly in computer systems? Conceptually, there are a few different approaches. Probably the one you're most familiar with is the idea of you authenticate with something you know. That is, in your mind, you produce a password, you produce a personal identification number, that is a PIN. Right. And of course, these don't have to just be in your mind. You could plausibly be writing them down or storing them in a password manager. Right. But canonically, these are things that something you know. All right. There's also another version is something you have. And this has been around for a while as an idea and also in practice, especially in industry. Right. But it's becoming increasingly something that you do as kind of just an end user, as a consumer, right? That is, maybe you just have the private key of a public-private key pair, and you use that to authenticate. So if you basically set up, SSH public key authentication, that's what you do, right? You might have a hardware device or a token, a USB token, where it actually basically has either some kind of a cryptographic key or the seed for a pseudo-random number generator. You might have, your phone, again, running particular software, probably with a crypto key or seed for a pseudo-random number generator. You might actually just have a unique string, we can call a token. If you authenticate it to a website, and then you store in a cookie, basically a string indicating that you're authenticated, because it's only known to you in the website. Right, but there are other ways too. So you could authenticate with something you are, that is a biometric. You could use kind of your iris, you could use your fingerprint, you could use your face, you could use, if we move into other types of authentication, not just logging into a system canonically, but continuous authentication. It could be your typing patterns or your behaviors, that basically are used to authenticate you. Right. There are also other things you could do. You could somewhere you are, and you could basically use location limited channels, and by essentially moving fast, we can estimate how far away. We can bound basically how far away you could possibly be based on the speed of light. Upper bound it. Right. And so then we could also, as those of you who have Netflix or other streaming accounts might have experienced, we can authenticate people by geolocating IP addresses. Right. And of course, all these different authentication schemes have different pros and cons and weaknesses. So I'm not saying that these are perfect ways of authenticating, but these are ways that practically we do try to authenticate people. Right. There are some other systems we can have. You could try and have people vouch for you in what's known as social authentication. We could also have a system vouching for you. Basically, you sign into one system, and then if you want to sign in somewhere else in a single sign-on approach, the system you've already signed into basically provides some proof to the other system that you can present there. Like, oh yeah, Blase is actually signed in. Please accept Blase, and they're going to use basically their cryptographic keys to sign these messages. Right. So there are lots of different ways we authenticate. So you might wonder, sometimes, well, how do we pick the best? And here, actually, one of the papers that really changed my way of thinking about this area and really gives a great high-level overview is from Joe Bonneau and others. It was published at the Oakland conference in 2012. It's called The Quest to Replace Passwords, a framework for comparative evaluation of web authentication schemes. And what I really like about this paper is it takes a step back, basically with the premise of, well, why do we still have passwords for web authentication when we all as security researchers complain about them all the time? Right, so Joe and his co-authors, what they did is they looked at different properties you would want in a web authentication system across three main dimensions. They looked at usability, they looked at deployability, and they looked at security. And so, since Space is very focused on security, let's start there, right? You might want or an authentication system for the web that's, for instance, resilient to physical observation or impersonation, or different types of guessing. Here they talk about throttled and unthrottled, and we'll see this in the case of passwords in a little bit, what this looks like. Resilient to things like phishing, theft, unlinkable, right? And so, not requiring a trusted third party who, of course, could be breached. Right, so these are all different properties we would want from the security perspective for our authentication system. Right, and I'll kind of break it to you that basically no authentication system has all of these properties, unfortunately. Right, but then of course, security is not the only thing we have to worry about. There's also deployability. So that is, things like it's compatible with different browsers and servers. That there's negligible cost. What we mean here is, well, making a password and storing a password you typically don't have to pay anyone for that. But if you need a USB hardware token, like a YubiKey, you're probably going to have to pay someone for that. Right? Looking at questions about its accessibility. Is it a mature technology that is everyone knows, knows it and understands it, from the deployability perspective? Is it not proprietary that we don't have to pay some company for patent licensing to use it? Right, and so these deployability concerns are actually somewhat overlooked, I think, and something that's really interesting to me at the moment. If you look at a kind of a password system, like you could build your own password system rather easily, but basically any web library that you're going to use is going to have some kind of library for authentication already built in, and it's going to be more or less based on passwords. Right. There are also these kind of usability properties that we want. Memory-wise, effortless would be you don't have to remember anything. So unless you're using a password manager, passwords don't have that property. Nothing to carry. Passwords do have that typically, as compared to a USB key that you have to plug into your computer and carry around with you, and you might lose. This being kind of easy to learn, efficient, easy to recover from loss, like, kind of if your biometrics, are stolen, you have a lot to worry about. If you lose your USB key, you have a lot to worry about, right? So there are all these properties you want, and then what Bono and his co-authors did is they basically made a giant table with not quite the color scheme I would necessarily use, but it shows essentially which different schemes have, and this is just the first bit of the table. It goes on and on and on, right? Which different schemes have which properties, right? And so ultimately, they show that, well, nothing is a silver bullet alternative to passwords. But the reason I want to present this is so that we think about all these different ways that we have to think about and evaluate an authentication system, right? We can't just say this is more secure and therefore it's the best. We have to think about how will it be deployed by system administrators? How will it be deployed if there's hardware involved that end users need to receive? How will people be able to use it? How will they even just perceive it? So it's, I would argue actually that this table is actually incomplete. It was an amazing first draft. There are a bunch of columns I would add, having worked on authentication for the past decade, right? But I think it's a really great way to look at these kinds of systematization of knowledge papers and get a good sense of, like, well, what are we thinking about in this area? Where is all the research, and kind of what contributions can we make both to the research literature as well as to the practice of security in the world. All right, but so as I promised, what we're going to do now is talk a bit about passwords, and by a bit I actually mean more than a bit. Right, and this particular graphic was made by my PhD advisor, Lori Craner at CMU, and Lori basically this is her bad password graphic. She's made it to Fabric. I have ties. One of my students at the University of Chicago recently made bad password masks. So there are a bunch of those all around our department, thanks to my student ally. And yeah, passwords are something, as I mentioned, I've thought about for years, right? And it was really alarming when I ended up writing my PhD dissertation about 5 years ago on passwords. And it was really alarming as I was writing this that I kept seeing these news articles like, passwords are dead. Yahoo wants to kill the password. Russian credential theft shows why the password is dead. Why a former Olympic athlete wants to kill your password. Google aims to kill passwords. The tech that will kill passwords, right? And so, I look at this and I say, well, passwords are still here. Google's now Alphabet and Yahoo is dead. So passwords aren't dead, and that's because if we look at their comparative advantages to alternatives, in a lot of cases they actually win out. Right? They're familiar to people. There's nothing to carry. They're difficult to coerce. They're easy to deploy, revoke, and replace. So they have some advantages despite their problems, right? But of course, we have to talk about the problems. So what can go wrong with passwords from the attack perspective? Well, one thing is what we can call an online attack, or rather what is called an online attack. And what this means is that the attacker is trying passwords on a live system, and it's usually rate limited. And so I mentioned before the idea of throttled guessing versus unthrottled guessing from the Bonneau et al. Paper, right? So here, this is throttled guessing. It's rate limited. So if for science, I made a Twitter account. I tried to log in using wrong passwords, and then after a small number of tries, it blocked me from trying to log in. It says we need you to wait for a bit before trying to log in again. To control abuse, we limited the number of attempted logins per hour. So this is how they do throttling. It's an online system, so Yahoo can just keep a counter, right? But online attacks aren't the only problem. There are also offline attacks. So that is, you basically, as an attacker, steal the whole password database. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, you'll, assuming that it's a sensible architecture from a security perspective, you'll get password hashes, right? You won't get the passwords themselves. Right, but so then you go and try and guess the password, and you can guess and check offline, just on your own computer without the system actually knowing that you're guessing and checking. Whereas in an online attack, they see you guessing and checking. Right, and it's there have been a lot of breached companies in the last decade, and companies that you've I'm sure heard of, LinkedIn, Sony, Yahoo, Adobe, so on and so forth. Right. So let's walk through this offline attack. So let's say where the company that's been breached is using a sensible approach, and rather than just storing that Blase is the password of a user, they'll store this hash, right? The thing that's in blue. Right. And as we'll see actually in the second half of today's activities, if you see the $2A and you've been cracking passwords, you'll say, that's a bcrypt password. Right. Right. So what happens is you get this password, the attacker figures out, well, what hash function has been used, probably. And then they basically make guesses, hash them, and look for a match. Okay. And what really happens here is, well, if someone stole your company's password database, they probably stole a bunch of other stuff from your company. So knowing users' passwords probably isn't that useful. Like the attacker's already in, right? So here the big problem is password reuse, which is something that's been of great interest to me and our research group for quite a number of years. Right, and by password reuse, we mean I use the same username on a bunch of different sites, and I don't actually have, this is a hypothetical, I have the same or a similar password on all these different sites. Right, so basically the attacker goes and tries to log in to other sites with the same password. Right, what else can happen? Well, there can be a phishing attack. The idea of I get an email that purports to be from Mainack Mondal, and it says, hey, you must, Blase, I need you to log in for your space tutorial right now. And it gives me a link, and I click on the link, and I'm not looking closely at where the link goes. And I end up on some URL, some website controlled by an attacker. And then I enter my credentials. But of course, I've given my credentials now to the attacker, so they have my credentials. So that's a phishing attack. Shoulder surfing is the idea of, well, I'm trying to enter my credentials, password or a PIN. Someone can see me doing this. The stereotype is they're looking over my shoulder, right? But it could be even more subtle. Like, I'm typing in my password on my phone and all of you here are watching me on this video call. So you're not shoulder surfing, you're just looking at your screen, right? There's also the idea of attacking a password protected file. So in these cases, this is throttled guessing. There's a very different notion of throttled here. It's, you can't in many cases, not all, unless you have secure hardware, you're not going to basically be able to say like, oh, you've guessed too much. Of course, if you have secure hardware, you can do much better throttling. All right, so let's go back to hashing passwords as I promised. Right, so I mentioned that, you're not gonna, if you're running a site, if you're the system administrator, you don't want to store a database of just the passwords. And the reason why is that if using SQL injection, an attacker grabs your database, well, then they'd have everyone's passwords, right, with no further effort. Right. So the idea of a hash function, if you've studied computer science, I'm sure seen a hash function. These are one-way functions that basically deterministically take some input and produce the same output every time, right? But given only the output, it's really hard to invert the function and get back the input. So going from an input to an output is easy. Going from an output to an input is really hard, right? And the password storage has evolved quite a bit over the years. In the early years, people said, oh, well, we should hash passwords. So let's just use the hash functions that we use for everything else, like checksums and so on and so forth. Right, so these are things like MD5, hash functions that were designed for efficiency, as well as some abstract properties of hash functions. Right, but in short, they were designed to be fast, because if you download a Linux distribution and want to run a checksum and make sure that none of the bits have been corrupted in transit, right, you want it to work quickly. And this is bad from a password perspective, because what an attacker can do is just guess and check really quickly. Right. So over the past, especially 5 to 10 years, there's been a really active research area on how do you design hash functions that, for instance, are intentionally slow or intentionally consume a lot of resources. And the intuition there is, well, if it's slow or consumes a lot of resources, it's going to slow down guessing. Of course, it will also slow down legitimate password checking by the same factor, right? But let's say if the attacker is, trying with MD5, attackers can try billions and billions of guesses per second, right? Whereas with these password-specific hash functions, even on really specialized hardware, they're not going to get billions of guesses per second, like not even close. Right, so this has also evolved quite a bit. There's some early functions. PBKDF2 is password-based key derivation function version 2. There's again an earlier version, bcrypt, which is actually how I had hashed Blase up. That previous version. Some of the more recent versions, which are the ones I've bolded and which are the ones that are typically recommended right now. scrypt, which is designed to be memory hard, which basically, consume a lot of an expensive resource, that is your RAM. Argon 2, which is has a lot of similar properties and actually was the winner of basically a contest for designing a password-specific hash function. So generally, you should be using things like Argon 2 if you're designing a system and you're in a position to make these decisions. Right. And of course, we'll want to be salting passwords. And so as you may have seen in some of your classes, if you're a student, a salt is a random string assigned per user. So the idea is you combine the password with the salt. Basically, typically you just concatenate the password and the salt, and then you hash them. Right. And so you keep the salt. The salt is stored in the password database. So you'll have the username and then the salt, and then the output of the hash function of the password combined with the salt. So what that means is that if someone tries to authenticate to your system, what they'll do is they'll send you the system their password. You look up their salt in the database, combine it with the password, and then hash those. right? And then you say, does this match the output of the hash in the database? If so, that must be the right password. Right, and this prevents the use of rainbow tables. And what those are cases where, hashing takes computational cost. So people realized, well, why don't we just hash once and store the mapping from input to output so we don't have to recompute the hash each time? And a rainbow table is actually a lookup table from the output of the hash, so the things you would get as a hacker who steals a password database, to what the input password is. So you don't actually have to do any guessing and checking as long as that mapping from output to input is in the rainbow table. Right. The other thing it does is it slows down guessing, because if there are 1 million users in the database, if it's not salted, you can just take the password, hash it, take a password guess, hash it, and then compare it to all 1 million users' entries. However, if every one of the 1 million users has a unique salt, and salts should be unique per user, then you actually have to repeat this process 1 million times. So you're basically slowing down the attacker's guessing by the same factor as how many accounts there are. Okay, so basically, you should be hashing and salting passwords, and things like to prevent a user error among system administrators. For instance, bcrypt actually requires salt. Right. All right. So let's talk a little bit about. So we have a question of salt will it be generated each time? And no, and the second part of your question suggests it's fixed per user. And so basically, it's fixed for it. Yeah, it's generally fixed per user. So like, let's say I go and I'm a user, I go and create a new password. And what the system will do is randomly generate a salt and then basically store that salt and then store the output of combining the salt and the password and then hashing them, right? And so typically until I change my password, I'll keep the same salt, right? Because if the salt changed, then I wouldn't be able to compute the same output of a hash, right? So we basically keep the salt. Yeah, good question. And I wanted to encourage the rest of you to keep asking questions. All right, so one of the things that's been really interesting, in kind of my time studying passwords is kind of how password guessing and password modeling has gone from kind of an art where people thought about it and how it might work to basically data science. And a lot of this started with this breach of basically like an online gaming site, basically a Facebook gaming site called RockYou back in 2009. And so prior to that, the way people would think about password guessing was typically like, well, let's take a dictionary and think about how, my friends and I make passwords from dictionary words. And then what you do is you basically try and guess based on that. Right? But it changed because with the RockYou theft of their password database, basically this contained 32 million users' real passwords. And they actually weren't hashed at all. They were in plain text. So we got to see, as an attacking community, basically the full distribution of passwords among these 32 million people. Right. So this was a gold mine unfortunately, from the defense side, but for the attack side, a complete gold mine for starting to reason about, well, how do people actually create passwords? We can look at this through data. Right. And then this is, I just cherry picked some of the breaches. The point I wanted to make is the breaches have been getting larger and larger and larger. And so, LinkedIn, suffered a breach that was, I believe that if I remember correctly, the breach was actually in like 2012, but it was released publicly in 2016. And this was over 100 million passwords. And they were hashed, but using a fast hash function. So, I have a file on my computer with like well over 99% of the plain text passwords from this breach. There are some that haven't been cracked to my knowledge, but almost all of them have. Right, just a year later, Yahoo disclosed that over 3 billion passwords have been breached. This is not a file that you can find publicly on the internet, but it gives you a sense of the scale of what people in the hacking community are working with, right? And in the last few years, there have been a couple of what are called the collections released. And so here we have basically billions of passwords in like one basically torrent file you can download. And parsing the data in the collections is is rather inconvenient. But some very intrepid students in my group have actually spent hundreds of hours of their lives parsing those. Right, and so totally, in total, we have over 10 billion passwords have been stolen from hundreds and hundreds of services. Right, so Mainack's wondering about community consensus on the ethics of using stolen passwords databases for research. Yeah, that's a great question, and research ethics is actually something that I think about a lot, both as a security and privacy researcher, where you need to think about research ethics if you're doing your job right, but just also as a computer science researcher generally. I think that's how computing and people in society work together is probably the most interesting aspect of computing for me personally. Right, and so there's this question of like, well, a bunch of people have suffered harm from these breaches. Why should we as researchers be using stolen data, like data that just fell off the back of a truck, basically, to use an American idiom there. Right, so I think when some of the early papers in the early 2010s that we published using basically analysis of stolen data, there were a lot of very valid questions in the peer review process of like, is it ethical to be doing these things? And so we had thought about it, like we were looking at how people created passwords. We weren't looking at personal information. So like, for instance, the online affairs website Ashley Madison suffered a big password breach. And along with the passwords, there's lots of data about the users. And so we intentionally don't look at that data about the users, because we think that would perpetuate and increase some of the harms. But we've thought about it, and we feel that looking just at the passwords is appropriate, because this is something attackers are using these leaks of passwords to improve their attacks. And so if we're as defenders not looking at these, then, well, we're giving the attackers an advantage, right? But I think I could absolutely see unethical uses of these. Like, if I tried to actually do a live attack against the service using any of these for the purposes of research, I think that would be highly problematic, because you could be causing harm to people. Or like, if I further distributed some of these, that would be causing harm to people. Right. All right. So I'm happy to answer any other questions too. Great. So how do we think about essentially understanding users and understanding passwords? Well, how do we study how people make passwords? As I mentioned, we could do retrospective analysis of the stolen password sets. We can also run large-scale studies ourselves. And this is something I did a bunch as a grad student at Carnegie Mellon, along with my colleagues there. And you could also examine real passwords. You could partner with a company and actually do analysis of actual users' actual passwords in a very controlled environment. You could also do what are known as qualitative studies. And so this is a technique borrowed more from a human-computer interaction in various social and behavioral sciences, where you actually could do like interviews of people and look at other kinds of data, not just quantitative data, but asking people, well, why did you create this password? And so I'll give you some examples of basically all of this. And broadly, what got me interested in passwords, for one part of it was that you get absurd advice about making a password. When I was a grad student, the Carnegie Mellon password requirements were, you had to have at least 8 characters, and I never understood why there was a hyphen there. There had to be an uppercase letter, a lowercase letter, a number, a special character, but basically only one of these special characters. If you tried other things, it would say, no, you can't do that. Had all this other stuff. And yeah, it's just like, it's easy to wonder, like, does this actually help people? Because the assumption had been, well, if you have a number, the space of possible passwords is much larger than if it were only letters. Right, but that's of course all theoretical. If everyone is just adding a 1 at the end, then you're actually not getting any benefit from kind of information theory style analyses of the space of possible passwords. Right, and this again gets into like kind of password analysis and authentication analysis, moving from people think about it really hard, just like sitting under an apple tree, like Isaac Newton or whatever, right? Moving from that to basically the data science of security. Right. And so another problem is inaccurate feedback. So Twitter has since changed their password meter, I believe, but it's 5 years ago in the Twitter password meter, it would say if you typed in password 1 exclamation point into the Twitter password meter, it would indicate that your password is really good. And I have news for you. Password 1 exclamation point is not a really good password. Twitter is lying to you. And that I guess that could be said in other contexts as well. Right. But it also gave you unhelpful feedback. Like, if Twitter didn't like your password, it would just say, please enter a stronger password, but wouldn't tell you kind of how do you get a stronger password? What makes a password strong? Right. So now I'd like to actually just, I'd like to pause for a second for any questions, and just so I can get a drink of water too. But yeah, are there any questions before we move on to some of my own research trajectory in the fun and exciting world of passwords?
Hi.
Hey.
You mentioned that the rules which are written about a character limit and stuff like that is not useful, and it makes the password difficult to remember also. But was there any precedent for this when this was adopted with the oncoming of the internet, or was this just randomly selected by a few executives in some business meeting?
Yeah, well, okay. Yeah, great questions. Yeah, so some of the, so kind of this goes back into like way before I was born, when people were studying authentication systems. They said like, okay, well, let's think information theoretically about the space of passwords and all that. And, it was like, oh, by having a larger space of characters, you'd have more possibilities. And this was untested, but it was just basically mostly thought about. And then the way this became propagated is, as the defender of a system, you want to basically typically do all the things you can to protect your users. And so from these people having thought about this, what makes a good password, they basically, this got written into different standards, organizations. And so Carnegie Mellon in part had these requirements because of a particular, information technology university federation they belong to, which said you have to have these requirements. That's our standard. And so the degree to which security requirements are basically derived from policy, I think, and just thinking about information security policy and how that impacts people and how do you actually change the standards actually becomes really important. And so actually in the US, one of the big standards organizations from the government is NIST, N-I-S-T, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. I might be messing that up. But it's, they essentially had an original standards document for authentication that also recommended these types of rules. And they revisited this about 5 years ago. And my colleagues at Carnegie Mellon and I basically wrote an open letter to them explaining our research on password composition policies and requirements. And, based on the feedback they got from our group and from others, they actually changed the standard. And so the newest NIST standard no longer says you should have like a number and a special character. And so this is an opportunity where you can actually have research make an important practical contribution, not just to security, but also to users having a good experience engaging with security and privacy technology. Right. And so we have another great question in the Zoom chat. Asking, have earlier works explored how good is this feedback mechanism, or what changes would users make after this feedback? I assume that's referring to kind of these password meters. And that's the best segue I could ever ask for, because the first project I did on passwords was exactly that. Do password meters actually have an impact? And that was my first year of grad school. It started as a class project where it was actually one of my senior colleagues as a PhD student had suggested like, hey, we've been studying passwords. I can't find any research papers about like, what do password meters do? And so this older student suggested this as a project. I took it up along with my peers. And that was my first using security paper ever back in 2012. right? And you can see actually this long list of co-authors is in part because it was a class project. Right, so we had basically seen that password meters are ubiquitous. They're all over the web, and they come in many shapes and sizes, right? And so this begs the question of, well, are some of these better than others? Do any of them do anything? Right, so we were interested in all these different facets about, well, do they impact security? Do they impact usability, like things like people's ability to remember the password? User sentiment, like are they happy or unhappy or annoyed when they're making a password? How long it takes them, so on and so forth. We were also interested in what features visually in terms of scoring of the meter actually matter. So we ran a study of over 2,900 participants online on a crowdsourcing service to study these questions. And so what we did is we basically took Windows Live at the time and their login page, and we used that as our baseline password meter. And what we did is we basically designed an experiment where each person would be assigned randomly, as it was actually round robin, so it was like condition A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D in that order, just to make sure it's the same number of each. To one of these, each person would see one password meter, right? So we took our baseline and kept the same scoring, and it was scored basically based on these requirements. This old style of what should a password look like, right? It should have a number, it should have an uppercase letter, it should be longer, so on and so forth. And so as I'll come back to later in this presentation, I don't think that's the right way to score passwords. So I've kind of fixed the error of my ways over time. Right, but we took that because that was the state of the art at the time. We said like, oh, well, let's try changing, having it be the same color all the time rather than changing colors from red to green as it got stronger. Let's try making a really tiny password meter, which was actually inspired by Google's password meter at the time. Then we said, okay, let's just try making it really, really big. Like if people aren't paying enough attention, if it's gigantic, maybe they'll pay attention. We tried taking away in our baseline meter these suggestions. Consider adding a digit or making your password longer. We tried taking those away. We tried actually keeping the text, but also taking the bar away. We also, there was this, Ed Felton, who's a security researcher at Princeton University, had this like kind of line in a paper I really liked, and I'm going to misquote it right now, basically about given the choice between security and dancing pigs, users will always pick dancing pigs. And we said, oh, well, pigs, I don't know about pigs, but what if we had a dancing Bugs Bunny? And so we actually tried, rather than having a password meter that's a bar, we had a dancing Bugs Bunny. And the stronger your password, the faster Bugs Bunny would dance for you. So these are the kinds of things you do when you're a first year grad student and you're just like trying to be very, very meta about papers you're reading. But yeah, and it's to this day, people still recall this research paper as the dancing bunny paper. So I guess maybe it had a good effect. And we also tried keeping the same visual design and changing scoring. One part of it was basically just being more stringent, just always giving them a lower score by a factor of 2 or a factor of 3. And so there, this was we were questioning, like, are people trying to get to a certain amount of the bar full? Or are they trying to fill it up all the way? Like, what do people consider a good enough password? And we also tried pushing them towards specific types of passwords, like longer passwords or passwords with more different character classes. Right, and so what we found is that the stringency of the meter actually mattered a lot. People who saw these stringent meters made stronger passwords, but none of these visual differences impacted the ultimate resistance to guessing. So like all these visual differences, if the meter was tiny or big or different colored, didn't really matter. Just the presence of the meter and how it was scored seemed to matter the most. Right. And what was especially interesting to us was that we didn't find a significant impact statistically on memorability across conditions. So even though passwords in these conditions, the stringent meters, were stronger, people, by our guessing model, people were not any more likely to have forgotten it by the second part of our study. Right. So ultimately, we took away from this, okay, well, password meters actually do something. That's cool. Right, but then at that point, I got really interested in how do you actually measure the strength of passwords. I mentioned we were doing this as a first year. I was doing this as a first year grad student back in, well, the paper was published 2012. I did this project in 2011. What we did is we basically to say, how resistant are these to guessing? We took this really influential paper that recently and very deservedly won a Test of Time award at the Oakland conference, IEEE Symposium on Security and Privacy, by Matt Weir and others when he was a PhD student at Florida State University. That proposed a probabilistic context-free grammar for modeling passwords, which had some really nice theoretical properties, and also he showed was better than a lot of other alternatives based on like dictionaries and kind of primitive password guessing at the time. Right. So we used that as as our strength metric. So then I got really interested in, well, is that the right way to measure password strength? And that actually led to the next project. So actually, there's a nice question here about kind of the native language of a person affects password strength. So, comparing German passwords versus English passwords. So yeah, there's a little bit of literature on essentially comparing passwords of different languages. Probably the most notable papers, there have been a couple that have compared Chinese language passwords to English language passwords. And actually one of the interesting findings there is that there are a lot of Chinese passwords that are actually just numbers, more so than in English. But yeah, I think, whether those are passwords, those are analyses based on the language used in the password, not the person's native language. So one of the like when you research passwords, people like to come to you after talks and tell you how they make their password, basically to show how smart they are. And so I've had a lot of people tell me, well, I'm so smart because I speak 2 languages. And so I'll use first half of my password will be in English and the next part will be in Tamil. And look how smart I am. No one will ever guess that. And no people will guess that. It is, there are combinatorics arguments to be made there. But yeah, so I think passwords and language is a super interesting research area. I keep when you work on a problem for a while, you eventually get to a point where you want to do different things. And so actually, when I started as a professor in 2017, said I was not going to do any more passwords research, and which has not been true. And kind of language and passwords is one of the areas that I remain actually really interested in. So yeah, happy to talk actually more offline about language and passwords. Yeah, but great questions all around, and just please keep them coming. Awesome. All right, so let's talk about this kind of what was my next Usenix security paper. It was as I mentioned, we were interested in essentially how do you model password guessing, right? So as I mentioned, kind of information theory types of approaches like Shannon entropy aren't great because essentially to actually compute Shannon entropy, you need an absurd number of passwords because most passwords appear only once, but they're of course highly related to other passwords. So essentially any realistically sized distribution, you can't meaningfully calculate entropy in the Shannon sense, right? But Joe Mainack, who previously referenced with the table with the crazy colors, he proposed in a different paper around the same time this notion of alpha guesswork, which I think is actually really cool. Looking at basically kind of distributions of different characteristics. Like he actually collaborated with Yahoo back when there was a Yahoo, and basically got anonymized histograms of passwords and made some awesome statistical arguments about measuring essentially the theoretical distribution of password guessability. Right, so those things are really cool, but they're not really practical in most cases for I'm trying to design a password meter and say how good your password is, right? So you don't get these per password estimates. You usually use this huge sample. And so what we and others ended up using is this notion called parameterized guessability, which I was going to attribute I did not come up with this notion. I was going to attribute it to someone, but I'm not sure they actually came up with it. But so this idea was around in the late 2000s, early 2010s. But the idea is how many guesses does a particular password cracking algorithm or tool with particular training data and particular configuration take to guess a password, right? So kind of in our offline attack scenario, you get some hash, you want to crack it, right? So what you do is you guess and check. You say, guess number 1 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You hash it, nope, doesn't match. Then you try password, doesn't match. Monkey, let me in. Password with some @ signs and zeros, doesn't work. Then you try Chicago with a 4 instead of an A, and like, hey, it matches. And the key of parameterized guessability is, well, you've done 6 guesses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So, okay, so now, great. So now the guess number here is 6. All right, so you can get a guess number for lots of different passwords. You can basically, maybe this password, James Bond 007, exclamation point, is guessed 366 billion, right? But if you're simulating an attack, you'll basically, or actually especially running an attack, you'll have some point where you like get to a really large number of guesses, and then you have to stop because there are only so many days in a lifetime. So you might be like, oh, well, this is past the guess cutoff. And of course, there's the question of well, would this ever even have been guessed by this method or not? And that gets into some subtlety of how some methods actually don't model the entire space of passwords. They actually only model some subspace. But ultimately, even if it would be guessed and it's going to be guessed at a sufficiently high number, you could say, oh, well, it doesn't matter what the number is because we weren't going to guess it. Right. So there've been is the guess number dependent on some total order? Yeah. So the if I'm understanding the question right, you essentially, as an attacker or as a person simulating an attacker, you come up with a total order of passwords that you're going to guess, right? And this kind of how you order things is the whole research community on password cracking, what's the best order in which to guess passwords, right? So a very basic thing is, I mentioned before, we've seen as a community billions of passwords, and so probably the best order is say, let's take all the passwords I've seen before, and then order them by frequency from the most frequent to the least frequent. So here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and a lot of kind of sets of leaked passwords will be the one you see most frequently, or password or monkey. And our research group at Carnegie Mellon was really interested in why does monkey show up so much. So we actually asked in a survey one time, anyone who made monkey as their password in the study, we said why monkey? And basically we just got a lot of they're cute. Monkeys are cool. I like monkeys. But yeah, monkey shows up a lot. Princess shows up a lot too. And it turns out that's a very common pet name, for dogs. So if your dog is named Princess, don't make that your password, please. But yeah, so it's kind of your best source of guesses are passwords you've seen before, from the ones you've seen the most to the ones you've seen the least. Right? But then after that, you have to come up with more guesses, 10 billion passwords. If you unique that, you're under 1 billion probably. So if you want to make more than 1 billion guesses, you need some kind of model for how do people pick passwords. Right. So one thing you could do is essentially brute force and just try every possibility in some total ordering. And that usually is not that effective. If you're doing like a lexicographic ordering from A, B, A, C, A, D, right? You're not guessing based on what's most likely. You're just going through all possibilities in a naive way. Right. So this idea of a word list is, what I discussed before of passwords you've seen before. We just call that a word list. Then there's the idea of a mangled word list. And this is software tools like Hashcat, John the Ripper, others. They, as you'll see in a bit, come up with a transformation language for basically, you can it's a beautiful language for specifying how should you change or transform or tweak a password to be different but similar. Right. And so that's a very common way that you'll get some hands-on experience with. All right. There are also some more kind of statistical models like Markov models, which you've probably seen in a computer science class, where you basically say let's based on characters, try and guess, basically find character transitions and probabilities. The probabilistic context-free grammar, which I mentioned, I'll show you some examples of all of these. Neural networks, which was, my colleagues and I at CMU, came up with the first neural network-based password guesser. Lots of other people have actually used different types of architectures, since then, and done some really cool stuff. But yeah, basically deep learning has gotten into the password space too. And then there's actually some idea of kind of what we call professionals in this particular analysis. It's like people who've been doing this for years are part of, Team Hashcat, or some of the Team Cynosure Prime, or these other kind of collectives of people who are password cracking enthusiasts. They don't just run a tool. They'll run a tool, look at how they're doing, change up their attack, look at what they've guessed so far, change up their attack. So there's a human element as well from the attack side. All right, so let's start with like some intuition for how these different attacks work. You have what we could call the mangled word list attack. So remember, it's like, imagine super is the most common password we've seen, passwords next, Chicago's next. The idea of mangling it is you have these rules, like append 1, turn A's into 4s, lowercase everything, right? So you basically go through and you make these guesses, like take everything on your word list and append 1. Take everything on your word list and turn A's into 4s if applicable. So super, of course, we probably could have skipped this guess because nothing changed. Then we try lowercasing everything. Right. And so, well, how big are your word lists? Like you could get like, if you want to kind of unique these passwords, it's usually in the tens or hundreds of millions, maybe up into billions of different words. And that your rule list can get actually really large too. So you can, if you look at this and do some basic math and assume it's like, multiplicative, you could get like, quadrillions of guesses, even just with these word lists. But, of course, hackers have private word lists and private rule lists. And so some of my friends in the community have very generously shared theirs with me. And so, yeah, those are much bigger. Right. So if we look at kind of software tools like John the Ripper, which is, was really, one of the most important parts of password cracking a decade ago. It basically takes this mangled word list attack and goes in, kind of rule major order. You basically take the first rule, and this is do nothing, and apply it to everything. Take the next rule, apply it to everything. Take the next rule, apply it to everything in the word list. Right. And so Hashcat is newer, is really designed for GPUs. And that actually, Hashcat actually has the same concept of a word list and a rule list, and does it in basically approximately word major order, right? And so you basically apply all the transformations to the first word, then to the next word. And that's actually not quite true. There's actually a really interesting batching strategy. And the size of the batches is actually based on, in large part, on how much memory you have in your GPU. So Hashcat's super well designed to be as fast as possible. So rather than trying to optimize how many passwords will you crack within some number of guesses, Hashcat's trying to say, let's try and optimize how many passwords you will crack in some amount of wall clock time. So the metrics we've used in some of our research don't quite do Hashcat the justice that it deserves for like how well it works. And so a lot of people in the password cracking community, myself included, use Hashcat. And you will too in the second half of today's tutorial. Right. And so then, to give you a sense of this rule language, there's actually a really, as I mentioned before, this beautiful rule language for how do you transform passwords. And you might notice there's stuff of like lowercasing characters, capitalizing certain characters, reversing the whole word, rotating things one character left, deleting a particular character, truncating the password, substituting, purging all instances of X, like remove every S from the password, kind of bitwise shifts, kind of incrementing ASCII values. You can actually have conditional rejections, basically saying, if I change the password and it doesn't have an A in it, then don't even make the guess. So it's actually it's a really interesting language. And we, in a paper, which I'm not going to talk about today, that I wrote, with my colleagues at UChicago 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, we actually did essentially not quite a formal analysis, but a analytical analysis of this rule language. And actually, in particular, we said, like, it would be interesting, if given a password and given a configuration of Hashcat, we could say, well, how quickly, is this password going to be guessed by this configuration of Hashcat? And if so, how quickly? Because up until that point, to answer that question, we would just run Hashcat and basically spew a lot of carbon into the air. And I'm kind of a hippie, and so that hurt my soul. So I said, let's not just run GPUs, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, like we're mining Bitcoin. But let's actually can we do a little bit of like math and reasoning and say, well, how many guesses would it take to get to this if it was ever going to get to it? And so we showed actually you can, we basically defined how you invert like basically all of these. There's a couple that are basically not invertible for reasons that I don't want to get into. But it was actually a really interesting exercise in trying to say like, how can we model this thing that wasn't designed to be modeled? Right. And so, so these rules get really complicated because you can combine all these operations. So this rule, you'd say star 05 003 D, apostrophe 7 is basically doing these things. Right. So, all right. So, actually, so at this point, I'd like to actually take the question. So the questions about, are these attacks oblivious to the identity of the user, right? Yeah. So yes, all of these particular attacks I'm showing are oblivious to the identity of the user, which is not the right model for reality, right? Because, this is what's called a trawling attack, where you basically just try the same guesses for everyone. So we're coming up with a total ordering that's the same across all users. Right, but if we have other information about a user, we would actually want to do a different attack. So we'd probably want to start with, if we know any of that user's previous passwords on the service, or that user's passwords on any other service, those should be our first guesses. And then we should actually probably try and transform those guesses in small ways. And then maybe we'll try common passwords, and then we'll try these kinds of things. And so, so absolutely, a targeted attack will actually have the initial guesses, any information we have about the user, we would actually leverage those. You could, of course, then try and do demographically targeted, or targeted based on name, or targeted based on any outside information, So actually there was this is years ago at PasswordsCon, which is an event I like a lot. This InfoSec professional gave a talk on, well, if you are trying to customize your word list to a particular organization, why don't you just actually scrape their webpage and look for essentially information on that webpage that's unique to that organization, like, using like topic modeling algorithms, essentially. And so this researcher, Matt, basically built a tool for crawling websites and determining how to customize a word list to a particular organization, which I thought was cool. But so addressing Shubham's question, social engineering plays a big role, but then you can also computationally model some of the ways in which you might want to target an attack. And I think all this stuff is super interesting, which is why I've been working on it for many years. Great. So great questions again. Please keep them coming. All right, so Hashcat, of course, doesn't just do this mangled word list attack. You can also do other things. So a mask attack basically is a brute force attack within a particular character class structure. So you could say, try guessing all passwords that consist of 6 digits. And there are many other attacks you can do, which I'll skip. So the idea, those are kind of software tools. There's instead the idea of using Markov models. So that is, given a big data set of passwords, or maybe even also dictionaries, but, typically passwords, and you'll have frequency counts for each. You want to build a model of essentially the probability of like different character transitions based on some context. So the simplest is like, what's the probability that, if the previous character is a P, that an A comes next, or a B, or a C, or a D, or an E, or an F. So what we do is we take all the data we've seen before, all the passwords we've seen before, not unique, so that we represent the frequencies, and we basically build this transition table. And people have done, these, different models of how much, context is actually appropriate. And so this is a 2-gram model, which is, basically saying 1 character of context. So if you just basically take shik4gu and say, how frequently does a G go to an O? How often does an O go to an O versus an O go to an end character, right? And so this is the whole idea of a Markov model. People found actually typically like usually around 5 or 6 characters of context works best, but then you actually have to do This is a group from Purdue and elsewhere years ago, did a great study of this. It was Jerry Ma and others. And they basically showed that, like, if you just use this, you actually will sometimes have zero probability, which doesn't seem quite right for things you've never seen. And especially if you have lots of characters of context, that seems wrong. So they can do basically probability smoothing, where you take things that are zero probability, which would mean a password is never ever guessed, and assign it some small epsilon probability. And that actually makes guessing a lot better. And like simple, obvious passwords that are different in small ways from things you've seen before can now be guessed. Right. So this question is, do people keep a similar rule pattern while keeping passwords in their native language? Can the pattern vary region-wise? Yeah, so it's kind of, I think there haven't, to my knowledge, there haven't been good studies on kind of, comparing very different languages. Like there hasn't been a good large-scale study of passwords in different languages, comparing different patterns. And yeah, I think it would be great for that kind of a study to happen. The problem is there is like, how do you get good data sets of, comparable data sets of passwords in lots of different languages? It becomes really hard. All right, so let's go on to some other approaches. So there's probabilistic context-free grammars, as I mentioned. The whole idea of this is you try and model the structure of a password, as well as the terminals, like that's what fits into the structure. And I mentioned that this is a Matt Weir's paper from 2009, recently won a Test of Time award. Super cool stuff. So the idea here is you basically first say, what does the structure of a password look like probabilistically? So here, this first password is 16 lowercase letters. So we'd say, oh, the structure is lowercase letters, 16 of them. Right. And then, well, it turns out one of the 6 passwords we've seen has the structure. So the probability is 1 out of 6. Right. Similarly, here we have 2 passwords that are 8 letters followed by 3 digits, password 123 and Nirvana 123. Nirvana spelled wrong, just to make this example work. So the probability there for that structure is 2 out of 6. So again, like, if you've never seen a particular structure, it'll have 0 probability. My grad school lab mate, Saranga Komandori, wrote a PhD thesis looking deeply at, this probabilistic context-free grammar model, and showed you actually probably should, do some probability smoothing there too. Right. But then I mentioned, you have a grammar for the terminals, which is basically saying, okay, well, imagine you have digits. If you have 3 digits, the probability that a string of 3 digits is a 1, 2, 3 is 100%, because we've seen it 2 times. We've seen 3 digits, and both times 2 out of 2, it's been the string 1, 2, 3. Right. So whereas we've seen a single digit twice, one time it was a 3, one time it was a 5. So each has a 50% probability. Right. So what we're doing is basically, saying, okay, well, what's the probability of a structure? What's the probability of the terminals in that structure? And the overall probability of a password is you basically take the structure probability times the probability of each of the terminal strings. Right. And these probabilities, actually, interestingly, if you think about it, you probably want to do something a little bit different, because the more different substructures you have, the lower the overall probability. But again, this is getting super into the details, which I've spent a lot of my life thinking about. Right, but ultimately, what I was interested in this research project was, how do you actually think about password guessability as a researcher? Because as a researcher in practice, as a researcher conceptually, we were like, oh, there's all these attackers doing this great stuff, and then we do our security analyses in our papers, and it was basically like grad students who were cracking passwords for the first time, downloading some software tool, trying to understand how to use it. And that was their security metric. So it was just like us trying our best. Well, neither of these is me, but you can imagine that. Right. So, so what we did is we actually took 4 different sets of passwords with different characteristics, and we actually tried modeling them with all these different conceptual approaches, these software tools, these different probabilistic models. And then we actually hired CoreLogic, which is the InfoSec firm that runs the DEF CON Crack Me If You Can contest and does lots of password audits for Fortune 500 companies. We basically said, set up your infrastructure so you can count your guesses too, and we'll compare what you're doing to kind of what we would get by just running these tools. And so ultimately, what we found is configurations of these tools is critical. So this whole idea of a grad student trying their best the first time they're cracking passwords is probably not the right way to do research. And also what we found is considering a single approach is insufficient. Whereas if you consider all these different conceptual approaches, the tool weight ones, the probabilistic ones, that was actually a decent proxy for what the professionals at CoreLogic were doing. But if you're looking at kind of these different tools, you could get a pretty good sense of how different sets of passwords compare. But looking at a particular password, how secure it was, is not robust to looking at just a single tool, right? So to an example of how per password granular security analysis doesn't work if you're looking at just a single tool. This password, password exclamation point with an @ and a 0. With John the Ripper and the way we had it configured, it was the 801st guess. Whereas with the probabilistic context-free grammar, which overall was actually performing better at guessing more passwords than John the Ripper, after 10 to the 14 guesses had not gotten to this, right? And it makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because, well, John the Ripper is really good at taking common passwords and then making small substitutions like A's to @ O's to zeros. Whereas the probabilistic context-free grammar assumes every time you actually change the character class in a password, these are unrelated. So for password 123 versus Nirvana 123, context freeness is a good assumption. But for this password, context freeness is a really bad assumption. This is very context dependent. Right. And so what we did is we then said, I spent a couple years of my life working on this with our colleagues there. And so we said, well, we wish everyone else would just use our security analysis, because we've thought about this for a few years, wrote a whole Usenix security paper just about how to do this right. And so then we basically stood up this password guessability service. That actually my colleagues at CMU, especially Michael Strukin and Luya Bauer, continue to run to this day. And so it's actually been really fun for me as a researcher to see, a huge number of people actually using this service for their password analyses, because it makes research across lots of different research groups and over time a lot more comparable with each other. So you can basically look at it and say okay, here's essentially what you would find, if this research group and that research group were doing security analysis in the same way. So yeah, that got me really interested in security metrics and just how we think about measuring security. Right. So then at the same time, we got really interested in aspects of kind of how people think about making passwords. So this is more of the human-computer interaction, or HCI style studies. So we had these papers, an interview study that Fumiko, who was a master's student, in large part ran, where we basically brought something like 50 people into the lab and watched them make passwords. And that was really illuminating for us in understanding how people think about password security. And then we also ran the study, kind of a large scale crowdsourced study where we had people basically compare different passwords and look at passwords other people had made and rate how secure they thought they were and how usable they thought they were. Right. And so this interview study, Fumiko study, there we wanted to understand where passwords come from. So as I as a grad student would look through these big stolen sets of passwords, sometimes I'd look at passwords and be like, I get it. There is there'd be passwords like I hate passwords, and okay, yeah, sure, I get where you're coming from. And then there'd be other passwords like LeBron 23, and I'd be like, I know where the 23 comes from because LeBron's a basketball player and his number's 23. This makes perfect sense. I see why it's LeBron 23 and not LeBron 22. Right? But then you get passwords like left brown 8 exclamation point, and you're like, I have no idea where this is coming from. Right. So this is the value of doing this study in the lab, where we had people make passwords in these different contexts and just watch what they were doing and then ask them what they did. So this particular password, we had people making a fake password for a National Daily Times fictional website. And what they did is this person saw this building on the left, and they're like, oh, it's a little bit left of center and it's brown building. So I'm going to make it left brown, and I'm going to make capital letters because I should have capital letters because that makes a secure password. And then I have to pick, I have to pick a number and a symbol. And I'm going to pick the two that look most like the building. It's like a tall building, and 8s are kind of tall and skinny, and so are exclamation points. Right. And so, yeah, these are the kinds of things which, as a security researcher, not considering lessons from human factors, I never, ever would have thought of. Right. And this, we did this whole study based on that. Well, actually, I guess I was looking at the wrong left brown building, but yeah, I don't remember which one it was. We'd have to go back and ask them. But yeah, so we found lots of misconceptions from the study about how important people thought digits and symbols were to passwords. And we generally thought there was a lot of misallocation of their effort in password creation, trying really hard to get symbols in, but people ending up with like symbols like exclamation points at the end, which is why we named this paper. I added an exclamation point at the end to make it secure. And then researchers from 1Password, from AgileBits, which makes the password manager 1Password, gave a talk at the Way workshop last year, riffing on the title of our paper, which I thought was kind of cool. Real good researchers. Right. Okay. So then I mentioned the study where we did kind of crowdsourcing of what people think of passwords. So there, what we did is actually we came up with this protocol inspired by my colleague Adam Aviv at George Washington University at this point. And he was interested in how people perceive the security of PINs. And I kind of stole this idea with Adam's blessing. And my colleagues and I applied this to perceptions of passwords. Right. So what we did is we said, let's have pairs of matched passwords and have people compare them. So I love you 88 and I eat kale 88. So it turns out, based on our password guessability service, I eat kale 88 is 4 billion times as secure. The guess number is, this one's guess number times 4 billion. Right. And so we asked people in this crowdsourced study, well, which one did they think was more secure? And they thought they were about equally secure because they were the same length. They both had 88. They both were 3-word phrases. Right. And so this is a misconception because, hackers, of course, have lots of data, and they know I love you, shows up, all the time in passwords. And because people have been asking about languages, it's not just in English. I love you in every language shows up, in like passwords. So you get like, te quiero in Spanish, you get te iubesc in Romanian, you get szeretlek in, Hungarian. We can just go on and on through different languages. I inadvertently got to learn all of these different, I love you in lots of different languages, which has not come in handy at all from this research. Right. But so again, more evidence of misconceptions here, and huge variance in what people thought attacker models would be. So we asked people like, how many guesses, would your password have to withstand from an attacker for you to consider it secure? And that was super interesting because we got everything from 3 to like, the number of molecules in the universe. And so like, okay, well, people are operating under very different assumptions of how their password's being attacked. And so these are the kinds of things we can, as we design systems, especially those that impact users directly and interface with users, we can do things really differently, right? If we know what's going on. Yeah. So then, kind of to breeze through this all a little bit, because I want to probably within the next half hour get to our activity. From this, this whole analysis of kind of metrics of password scoring, I was kind of like, to my lab mate Sadanga at one point, I was like, I wish there were like variable length Markov models, because it sucks that like sometimes, in a password, you want a lot of context with these like, 5-gram or 6-gram Markov models. Those work really well. But like sometimes you just want no context at all and just want to kind of look at it and be like, oh, if it's like, space conference, if you're like going like the E in space, you care a lot that it follows SPAC, but this, or how about space password? And so the P in password, you don't care at all that it follows space. It's like a totally different thing. So I was complaining to Sadanga that Markov models have this fixed amount of context. And he was like, dude, check out like neural networks, check out like recurrent neural networks and like LSTMs. Like this is probably what you want because it can like take in variable amounts of context. And so, yeah, so basically Billy and I and some of the others on the team started playing around with different types of neural network architectures. And indeed, Sanango is right. And so we basically said, like, well, how can you basically take all this research on natural language processing with neural networks, which at the time in 2016, 2015, I guess we were doing this in 2015. At the time in 2015 was still very primitive, and NLP and deep learning has really exploded in the last few years in ways I think are really fascinating. But yeah, so we said, like, let's try and build a neural network model, and especially it would be cool if we could build a better password scoring mechanism, for web authentication. And specifically, what we wanted is a model that gives real-time feedback and then runs entirely client-side. So this client-side thing was the really exciting part for us with neural networks, because your model size can be big, like big in terms of bits in some ways, like, because like in that, like 20 megabytes is big in terms of bits, but like compared to the leaked data sets of like 10 billion passwords, 20 megabytes is really small. And so but 20 megabytes, you can maybe get client side. You probably don't want to. If we could get it under a megabyte, that would be really cool, because then we could do it client side, like in a web app for lots of parts of the world with fast internet connections. So that was a big motivation. So then we said, okay, well, let's try and generate passwords, using neural networks. And Billy worked out a lot of this in a way I think is awesome. Is like, well, basically saying, similar to kind of Markov models, you basically want to build a probabilistic model for given some amount of context. You want to spit out the probability of the next character, right? And so, I mean, this is what neural networks are basically. What RNNs in large part are designed to do, is given some context, spit out a classification. So this is basically a classifier of what character comes next based on the context, right? And so we start off with like, well, the password, given an empty string, you're going to start a password with 100% probability, right? But then, well, what's the first character of a password? 5% chance the first character of a password is C, right? And then go on and on and on, and it becomes multiplicative of kind of what's the probability of the next character relative to the others, to the ones that preceded it. And we did have a cutoff. I think it was something like 10 characters was the cutoff for context, right? So we basically compared, well, how does the design space of this neural network model impact password guessability? So we tried basically, different model sizes. We tried transfer learning to different password composition policies. We tried different types of training data, like does it help to have dictionaries in there as it does for a lot of other password guessers, or is it actually best to just have passwords? And it turns out the answer is just having passwords for neural networks. So we basically tested on a lot of password sets, and then we estimated the guess numbers using Monte Carlo methods. And so I'll do a quick look at this graph. Here we have on the x-axis guesses on a log scale, and in the y-axis is the percentage of a password set guessed. So higher is better, more accurate guessing, right? And so if you look at these neural networks, they actually end up being better than any of these previous approaches, in our particular testing. So this is comparing the green line, and the black line is basically saying, for a given password, what's the fastest any of these methods got to it? And it was generally a neural network was pretty close, to getting to it fastest. Right. So, and interestingly, large models weren't a huge advantage. Like you got some advantage from a larger model comparing the dotted lines to these the continuous lines. Right, but it didn't really matter that much. Right. So then what we did is said, okay, well, we have a 3 megabyte model. Can we make it smaller? And so Billy did a bunch of great engineering in terms of quantization, some lossless compression, and basically doing some cool pre-computation and caching in intermediate results. And actually, we got our model down under a megabyte, and it was basically latency in a browser in JavaScript of about 17 milliseconds per character. So basically, we said we can get a neural network in the browser running really well. And what actually, one of the artifacts we noticed was that this browser, the neural network model was good for most passwords, but for some passwords, would actually miss some really obvious passwords. So we ended up actually using a Bloom filter to catch, basically obviously bad passwords that the neural network didn't realize were bad. And so that's kind of, I think, an interesting thing to think about in terms of security engineering is sometimes you need, this isn't quite defense in depth. It's kind of using multiple methods to achieve your goal, because, we weren't going to fix neural networks to be perfect. That particular thing was impossible. So we said, oh, well, we have a little bit of space. Let's just have a Bloom filter to catch these things that are slipping through the cracks. Right. But of course, as someone who's really interested in kind of usability of these tools, like neural networks are not very intelligible. And we said also, like, we're not going to fix explainable machine learning in our next project, but what can we do to actually help people make better passwords? So we built this data-driven password strength meter. And basically what it did is, had principled strength estimates from our neural network, but then also gave data-driven feedback to users based on, a bunch of heuristics. So like if your password were unicorns with a zero instead of the O, it would say, don't use simple transformations of words or phrases, capitalized letter in the middle rather than the first character. And so what we actually did is we took the literature and our own experience of kind of how people make passwords in terms of natural language, and came up with 21 different characteristics, basically heuristics, where we could actually say, well, what feedback should we give? And in part, this is actually based on what ended up being unpublished work, because we could never get anyone to publish it, where we did this thing that I thought was really cool, where we reverse engineered passwords through crowdsourcing. Basically we wanted a data set of like, how does natural language turn into a password? So we would show kind of crowd workers these passwords and have them basically say, well, what was the natural language initial part of this inspiration? So this person found, this is tilde, cows come home, which again is an idiom in English. So I thought this kind of stuff was really fun. But yeah, no one ever wanted to publish it, but it helped us build a better password meter, so everything was okay in the end. Right. So ultimately, what we did is we designed and tested this meter. So we engaged in lots of user-centered design. Actually, let me just pause for a second. The morning sun is streaming through my window and making me blind. So give me one moment, and as you're doing that, queue up some questions. All right, so now that I'm not blind anymore, let me continue. Right, so what we do is on this password meter is we do have kind of the typical bar, but then we provide this text feedback, which is different than most other password meters. It's basically different than any password meter we'd seen to that point. And specifically what we did is this feedback, going back to kind of the Twitter example that I made fun of, like make a better password, make a stronger password. It tells you actually how you could do it, both in terms of things you shouldn't do, like not using dictionary words, and things you could do, like inserting digits into the middle. And notice we say into the middle of your password because that was a lot less common than things at the end. And if you actually showed your password on screen, it would actually explain what specifically you're doing wrong. Right. So this whole data-driven password, long story short, we tested it. We found it worked. I'm going to skip a bunch of these slides. We found it worked actually, a lot better in terms of having more secure passwords. So this is kind of none is no password meter. Bar is just the bar, and std is the standard version of our password meter with the explanations in text. And so here, graphs we've seen to this point, we were looking at guessing. So higher was better. Here, lower is better because that means fewer passwords were guessed. And so what we found is actually, it kind of worked better than we thought it would. which was a nice surprise, when you do a research project, you're like, I hope this works a little bit. And then it like really works. You're like, wow, this is all we had to do is add this password meter and people make much better passwords. And like, still not perfect, but it's pretty good. Right. And so ultimately we also we looked again at kind of usability analyses and found people weren't, the passwords were not less memorable. Although the more feedback we gave it, people, they did find it more annoying, which is fair. It is more annoying. Right. So this is something, a meter we released open source. You can play with a demo if you really want. But yeah, that was kind of, my trajectory of research over the course of a couple of years on passwords. And so I figured I'll pause for a second for questions, and then I'll give a little bit of kind of where I think authentication is going now.
So, Blase, I actually I was just wondering, it's fascinating work as usual, and that's a great overview. So what I was wondering is that, so from the guessability point of view, after almost like couple of years of actually checking this out, what do you think a good measure of guessability for a practical purpose? Perhaps we will come to it later, but summarizing like whatever different methods that you evaluated and checked, what did you think? What is your feeling?
Yeah, in terms of kind of practical guessability, it depends on your context of like what is practical. So like if you are trying to do something in a web browser, you don't have much space, we felt like neural networks are like the most practical, because like it's a good principled model that you can get in like not much, in like less than a megabyte, right? Whereas like, if people who are doing research, ultimately if you're defending against an attack, you want to defend against like all attacks. And so this notion that we had in our 2015 paper about like, well, let's take the lowest guess number across all the different approaches, call that the minimum guess. For kind of research purposes where you have unlimited resources, that really is kind of what matters the most. And then there's essentially, this question of like, well, how many guesses do you have to defend against to be enough? And that actually becomes really interesting and nuanced. Whereas like if you're defending against an online attack with like really aggressive throttling and rate limiting, like maybe it's like on the order of like a few million. If it's not in the first couple million guesses, you're probably safe. And assuming also it's not a password you've reused elsewhere, right? But if it's a password that's hashed with MD5, like you're up over here in essentially this guessing curve where you'd have to be like, okay, maybe this is now safe, right? And so a lot of it just depends on kind of this nuanced situation.
Right. I guess there's another question from Gunjan in the chat.
Yeah. So the question's, would you comment on how memorable passwords were from the feedback? So actually I skipped over kind of, generally how memorable passwords were in these different studies we did. This was a couple years ago. Off the top of my head, it was most people remembered their password. And we looked at memorability in a couple of different ways. We first excluded, we actually at the end of the user study protocol asked people if they had written down their password or stored it in a password manager. We also, did some JavaScript trickery to look for kind of evidence of copy pasting or autofilling of passwords. And so we only looked at people who didn't autofill passwords or write them down. And yeah, it's off the top of my head, I remember it being something like maybe like 75%. I might be totally wrong. You'd have to look at the paper for this, but like, most of the people remember their password. And if you think about it, this is like, something they were just doing for a study. And we also told them very explicitly, don't use one of your real passwords. Getting back into the ethics of data collection, like we did not want their real password, but also would mess up the science if they're just using the same password as everywhere, because then they would automatically remember it. So ultimately, it's passwords were pretty memorable, even though we were getting them to do somewhat different things. Of course, there are these questions of like, well, if every different website were doing this and you had different passwords everywhere, it'd be really hard to remember your passwords everywhere. And, I think that would be a very valid criticism. So like, we've been looking at, I think this is actually a nice transition into like, where do I think authentication is going and how do we think about it? this is something where like I don't, having 100 different passwords for 100 different websites is not the right state of the world from a security or a usability perspective, right? So ultimately, I think where I see passwords fitting in the authentication ecosystem is you have like a small number of passwords that you remember, and then everything else should be bootstrapped from that, right? And we can start thinking about like, well, what are these practical challenges of authentication? Like, I forgot my password. Do you send them an email, which assumes, only the authorized user has access to their email account, which may or may not be true? Do you ask them security questions? Like the answer is you should not ask them security questions. These are like, you don't ask them, what is their dog's name, or what was their childhood best friend's name, or who was their third grade teacher, or what was their first car, or something like that. These ideas of security questions have been completely debunked at this point because they're way too predictable. Yeah, actually, amusingly, hopefully maybe this came across in my talk, but I just kind of like doing wacky things sometimes, because I think that's where a lot of the most creative and interesting ideas come from. And so this quarter at UChicago, I've been teaching a class on jointly with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and it's all about privacy and surveillance artworks and interactions and communications. And so actually some of the students in this one of the groups, which is a combination of computer science and art students, actually built this interactive installation where it's a chat bot which tries to make this like Instagrammable experience, and you have it's super fun where it's like talking to you. It's the voice assistants talking to you about like its birthday and asking you your birthday. It's talking about all of its pets and asking you about its pets. And then like, having these cool projection mappings and trying to get you to take pictures and post it on Instagram. And then what it does is at the end of the installation, this printer comes to life and it starts printing out these dossiers of you, like very scary FBI files. With all your answers to your security questions. And so, yeah, so just this is one of the things that's really interesting to me right now is how do we communicate about security and privacy, and like what role does interactive artwork have in this field? Right. Yeah. So anyway, so resetting accounts. Yeah. So password managers, I think, are actually a really good thing. When people say like, I have, my solution is I use the same password everywhere. I say, no, don't do that. Use a password manager. Depending on the architecture of the password manager, you might be trusting all your passwords to a particular vendor, a particular software, or if it's something where you basically have a password vault that's unlocked by a single master password through like some kind of a password-based key derivation function, right? Like you're trusting it all there. Like this is scary, but this is better than password reuse, right? Because password reuse, I think, is actually a really interesting aspect of the authentication ecosystem right now. There's kind of people at Mozilla, people at Google are working on really interesting stuff here. Of course, the Have I Been Pwned website that Troy Hunt runs, super interesting thinking about password reuse, right? And then, researchers at Cornell Tech and other places, people at Duke doing really cool work on, how do you actually check for compromised credentials? And so this whole ecosystem, I think, is super interesting problems of like, well, Google wants to protect you from not using the same password on Google that you've used elsewhere, especially if it's been in a data breach. But like, you probably don't want Google and Facebook talking and sharing your password on each site. Like, so like, how do you actually do compromised credential checking? Like, where is it? Is it server to server communication? Is it happening in your browser? Is it your password manager doing this? Are you looking only for exact matches? Or are you looking for approximate matches? If it's not exact matches, it becomes a lot harder to do this checking because you can't just like say, like, oh, the hashes are the same in both places. And if they're being salted, they wouldn't be the same in both places anyway. So yeah, I think very interesting questions, both in terms of usability and communication to users, as well as kind of, cryptography-based security protocols. yes, if you're interested in this, like check out kind of how Google password checkup works and some of the academic work from Tom Parts group following up on that. Right. Of course, one of the things we've been interested in is, some of my former students published a paper I'm proud of about password reuse notifications of like, how do you tell people that like, their credentials have possibly been compromised? And some of my other students are running some really interesting follow-up work, which probably should not talk about yet. But yeah, I think, there's, these questions of like, how do you fix this ecosystem of password reuse? Well, I can do my part and tell all of you on this at this conference, if you use the same password or similar passwords for different websites, stop doing that right now. And, use a password manager, write them down, do whatever you need to do, but just don't reuse passwords. Right. There's of course single sign-on systems, which is like conceptually like a really good way of solving this problem. But of course, you're now trusting a third party. And then there's questions of like, well, what are the intentions and goals of the third party? Like having Facebook log you in everywhere. Is this actually what, even if it's what you want to do for your security, is it what you want to do for your privacy? Right, of course, two-factor auth, through Google Authenticator, through Duo, other sites is a really interesting way of saying, okay, well, now it's not just do you know your password, but do you also have possession of a device that's been registered to use this authenticator? That actually is a nice way of architecting the system. We talked a little bit about physical tokens and how this can become problematic. WebAuthn is actually, I mentioned this in passing right at the beginning, the FIDO2 project is trying to basically, make web authentication a lot better. And so like, how can we have passwordless web authentication? And so it's this WebAuthn project is awesome because it's basically using either your computer or phone or your device as an authenticator. And so rather than rather than having a kind of a trusted third-party service doing sort of single sign-on, it's not really single sign-on. It's actually you're authenticating to your hardware, either your existing device or something you're plugging into your existing device, and it's basically doing public key crypto to log you in and kind of registering with different keys for every website. Super cool project. And actually, I'll show you really quickly. I intentionally unshared my screen to just bring this up. Some of my collaborators and I have been really interested in WebAuthn. Just go into presentation mode. So this is we were really interested in essentially some of these user-facing components of this. There's actually also been some real great work recently on WebAuthn is supposedly phishing resistant, but there's been some great work of saying, is it really phishing resistant? So this is work that my collaborators and students, Leona, Annika, and Max ran, where we did this project, published it at Usenik Security this past year, looking at kind of misconceptions about FIDO2 biometric WebAuthn. So this is the whole idea that you can use the WebAuthn protocol, to log into websites with your fingerprint. So like, a handful of sites support WebAuthn at this point, including eBay. So you could actually on eBay, you get this notification, you can use your fingerprint, face, or PIN to sign in to eBay from like the same one you use for your phone or tablet. And it's cool because what it does is it actually gets rid of passwords and lets you log in just by locally authenticating to, for instance, your phone with your fingerprint. Your phone then logs you into eBay, no passwords involved. Right. So what we were interested in is like, okay, well, like, do people actually realize, what's happening through any of the ways companies are communicating about this? And so like, there's of course this potential misconception of like, well, are people going to just assume that if they're signing into Facebook with their fingerprint, Facebook must have their fingerprint? Like, that's a very reasonable expectation. It's wrong because this protocol, WebAuthn, has been designed in a really clever way, right? But ultimately, this is, we need to think about how does the user fit into all of this. Right. So Leona and Annika and Max did this, cool set of studies where we basically looked at people's misconceptions, and in fact, using essentially these, the ways companies are currently communicating about WebAuthn. 2/3 of the people thought their biometric, their fingerprint, was sent to the website when they're logging in with their fingerprint, which again is wrong. But of course, these kinds of things, if people think Facebook's getting their fingerprint, they won't adopt the WebAuthn protocol, and then we'll be stuck with passwords. So these kinds of questions of like, how do we think about, improving communication? Super interesting to me. So actually what we did is we did a kind of, as part of this same paper, the second of our 3-part study is we did actually focus groups where we had people use this method known as co-design to basically work together in these online focus groups due to the pandemic, and come up with new notifications of what they might look like. So they did a lot of time drawing things, and then actually trying to basically say, well, what's the right way to actually communicate about biometric WebAuthn specifically, right? And so we actually ended up designing a bunch of different notifications with different communications about like your fingerprint or face is only stored on your personal device, is never shared with third parties, never leaves your device, all these different things, backed by Microsoft, Google, and Apple. Turns out people, this was not the way to do it. People don't care it's backed by Microsoft, Google, and Apple, right? Things like that it's only stored and it's never shared was much more effective. Yeah, but broadly, I just wanted to mention that, of just kind of giving you a sense of the broad spectrum of security research. I think is really important for making systems practically secure in the real world. Right. So ultimately, we talk about biometrics. I think the last thing I want to say about biometrics is that it's really interesting how you store them, right? Because passwords and things like that, like a password, you store it and you have essentially this like deterministic matching. Like you say, oh, someone presents a password, you salt it, using the salt that's stored in the database, you hash it, and either it matches or it doesn't. It's a string comparison, right? With biometrics, this is not a string comparison. So, people say like, okay, well, how do you store biometric templates? And like, what is the matching algorithm? How can you store these? Like, there's not really quite that. There's an asterisk to this, but there really isn't a great equivalent of a hash function for a biometric template, right? There's of course work on stuff like fuzzy extractors, and so some really interesting stuff there. But it's much more nuanced and complicated than with hashing a password in a string. Right. And of course, once you store a biometric, if it's stored in the wrong way and is leaked, well, then the attacker now has your biometric. You don't you have approximately 10 fingers, you can't replace them. Like, you can't just be like, I forgot my fingerprint, I need a new one, and so just thinking about these aspects of authentication and how we get to practical authentication, I think is worthwhile. But it's just been also interesting to me, just like, looking at authentication and how it manifests, like when essentially, this is 7-8 years ago, when fingerprints first became a thing with Touch ID on the iPhone and Android. I first trying Face Unlock, and they still sort of have Face Unlock, but now most Android phones also have fingerprint readers. And actually, in the newest version of the Pixel, the fingerprint reader is moved from essentially the bottom of the front of the device into essentially part of the screen. But it's kind of what I want to just conclude with in this, the me talking part of this, is authentication is actually just generally really hard. It's hard for system administrators. It's hard for users. It's hard to get right along all the dimensions you need to get it right. Right. But unfortunately, authentication is also generally necessary. So I wanted to just, kind of end the talking part of this presentation here. We have a question, and I'll take a couple questions. Mainack asked, desired properties of biometric data hash function. They're different from typical hashing functions. Yeah, so the desired properties are really different in that you want approximate matching, because it's essentially, even if you use some kind of alignment algorithm, so like you take a fingerprint and you find what are known as minutia points, and then basically have a mapping of that. But unless you're, in the exact same orientation, even if you try and transform the orientation, it won't be quite right. You want to be able to deal with like my finger is sweaty or my finger is dirty. So you want an approximate match rather than an exact match. And so that's why, if you just take these minutia points, try and do some kind of alignment, turn it into a string deterministically, and hash it, it's not going to work, because it's the odds of someone coming up with, with the exact same minutia points, all in the exact same orientation, even if you try and transform it, it just doesn't work. And basically, try it if you don't believe me.
Right. So basically, what I was hinting at possibly is that the cryptographic hashes this avalanche property, like one bit change in the string will change the half of the bits in the hash. That won't really be useful in this case at all.
Yeah. So this kind of like approximate match, and there's this whole area of crypto dealing with fuzzy extractors, and like basically, can you get an approximate match in there? So
right.
Yeah, so the desired property is, one of the things that's very desirable is you want it, because if your biometric is compromised, you don't want to be able to, if the way it's stored is ever compromised, you don't want the attacker to be able to reverse engineer your minutia map.
Exactly.
Right. So there you basically want it to be slow, but now, so like in the same way that kind of password checking with like, hash functions like argon2 for strings is intentionally slow, you want to actually design. Okay, yeah. So I see your question now. You want to design the same slowness in, but you want it to be slow. You want to slow down attackers, but still have it be fast enough to not add a huge amount of latency to legitimate authentication attempts. And so I think kind of the ability to throttle guessing offline to prevent your biometric from being released is probably the main property you want. But also, like, you want to think about like how approximate, what is a match? How similar does it have to be?
Thanks.
Yeah. But yeah. Really, for any of you who are interested in crypto, I think that's a really interesting area. But I'm biased. I love authentication. Cool. Any other questions before? What I'd like to do now is Mainack, can we take a 10 or 15 minute break?
Yeah. We can do that totally.
Yeah. Okay. So how about we come back in maybe about 10 minutes from now. And then what I'll do is set you up to all start doing some password cracking.
Sounds great.
All right. So see you in about 10 minutes.
So let's start. So we'll come back after the break, and please take it away.
Great. Yeah. Great. Yeah. So welcome back from the break. There was a good question from Shubham, actually in the chat, which I missed in Slack, and asking about in WebAuthn, do we have trusted hardware? And the answer is yes, you have trusted hardware. And that basically it's in your trusted hardware, like on your phone, where your crypto key, your private keys are stored. And so essentially the architecture of WebAuthn with biometrics is, your fingerprint data, some kind of template is stored in trusted hardware, as are your crypto keys. And you, from there, you essentially use you use your fingerprint to authenticate to the trusted hardware. And then that's basically saying, oh yeah, yes, you can use my private key to try to log into this website. So it's a really cool design, actually, from a security perspective. Great. All right. So in both the sorry for missing that before the break. I realized, actually, for whatever reason, my name is set as FD46, which is either someone messing with me or me messing with myself, which is probably more likely. So yeah, great.
It might be automatically assigned by Slack if they couldn't get your name.
Yeah, that's cool. So actually, let me change my profile. Let me change my name. Edit profile. This is bothering me. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay, I know what I did. That's funny. So right. So great. So anyway, so what we're going to be doing is let me share my screen, desktop too. What I've done is I've set up this URL on my lab group server. And so here, if you want to participate in this, which I encourage you to do, you're going to actually have to install some stuff. So what it is I made 3 sets of passwords. So if you open these, so we have some hashes, and password set 1. Some other hashes, a different hash function clearly, and yet a different hash function, right? So what we have is we have 3 sets of hashes, and there are passwords, human created passwords underlying these, and I want you to crack them. And so what I'm recommending is download Hashcat. And if you have a GPU, install the GPU drivers. If you have a CPU, you might actually have to install drivers too. And so this is actually the most annoying part of getting this all to work. Is getting Hashcat to work is not completely trivial. And so here, download the binaries for Hashcat. So that's basically, this works for Linux, Windows, and Mac. So this is one of the few so it's actually a 7-zip file. So if you don't have 7-zip installed, you might have to install 7-zip to unpack this file. And then you'll see an appropriate binary for your operating system, right? But to get it to work, you actually need a particular driver. So, on Linux, if you have an AMD GPU, you need this driver. If you have an NVIDIA GPU on any platform, you need these drivers. If you have an Intel CPU, you need these drivers. Yeah, so it's like, this is not completely trivial. And yeah, so get these drivers up and running, get Hashcat up and running, and then you should be able to launch Hashcat, from the command line, right? And so here, what I did is, I said, once you have these files, these 3 different password sets, first thing is you need to do is figure out what hash function was used. So I actually suggest this script online called hashtag. So if you go there, and you try my example, it basically says, here's a hash, and I'm blocking it with no script. So you put in this hash, blocking so many different things with no script. I don't want to, whatever. So I imagine I had JavaScript actually running, and you could actually basically put in a hash, and it'll tell you what are basically possible hash formats that have that kind of output, right? All right. So then what you can do is, once you know the hash, you have to tell Hashcat which kind of hash are you trying to guess. So you look at their list and see oh, was it MD5? If so, that's mode 0. If it's SHA-256, it's mode 1400. So you're going to have to basically do some detective work and figure out what hash might it have been. And you'll notice it actually supports lots of different hashes, like from the software TrueCrypt, which is now somewhat deprecated, on and on to VeraCrypt, which actually replaced TrueCrypt. So you can see that basically, Hashcat can be used to crack most things like VirtualBox, MongoDB databases, Apple Keychain, so on and so forth, Bitwarden. So yeah, Hashcat is awesome software, if I haven't emphasized it already, even though you're going to have to deal with a GPU driver unpleasantness. Right. So then what I did is I said, I gave you some examples of like different attack modes. So figure out what's the right invocation of the binary for your operating system. So this is, kind of running this binary on on Ubuntu, which is what I'm running. And then you basically say, here's the file of hashes I'm trying to crack. So it's going to be one of these files. And then you say, what mode am I using, which is going to have to be from their list. And then you give an attack mode, which you can read about in the Hashcat documentation. And so this is basically saying attack mode 3, which is a mask attack, and try and guess everything with all 7 character strings of letters. Right. This is basically saying try attack mode 0, which is word list with some file called password.txt, which, well, I haven't given you such a file, but you can get files from below. Right. And then you could also give it mangling rules. So I give you an example of how to invoke best64, but there's Hashcat comes with different mangling rule sets. Right. And so what I did to get you started is I gave you I just directly posted the RockU data breach. So here, like, you can actually start doing fun stuff. So here, like, if you look at the RockU data breach, which I posted for you, I'm going to just like, if you are having trouble getting Hashcat running, you might actually even have fun just looking through the data breach. And what I did is we pulled out all the usernames, so that this is just the passwords. So if you look at how many lines you have, approximately 32 million lines of passwords, and you can start doing fun stuff like looking for LeBron in RockU. So as I promised, LeBron 23, it's always 23. Except for LeBron 10. This person is just confused. Right, you can like look up space. Oh, it's a lot of MySpace. Right. So you get the idea. So if nothing else, if you're having trouble getting Hashcat running, you can try some analytics on RockU. I give a link to a lot of other older password breaches. This is the newer ones are actually quite large. So I probably not the right thing to do. And then some other word lists, which is probably pretty optional. Right. So what I want you to do is, if you're interested, try cracking some passwords, and I'm here to try and help. And I expect some of you are going to run into some big problems with getting the drivers to work, and then we can try and debug it as a group in Slack or on Zoom. But yeah, are there any questions about what I'm thinking you all can do? Okay, looks like no questions. And so yeah, why don't you just go away, start cracking, and I'll be here to help. And I'll be actually at the end of the tutorial. If anyone wants to report their progress, I'll be super curious to hear how far everyone has gotten. Hey, everyone. So I guess since the tutorial's ending in about 4 minutes, I think it'd be interesting for any of you who are on the Zoom call who tried and either succeeded or failed to crack some passwords or even get Hashcat working. I'd be curious for you to share your experiences. So why don't you, if you'd be willing to share your experience, why don't you just raise your hand in the Zoom chat? So I know from Slack, some of you succeeded in cracking some passwords. Yeah, Shubham, what was your experience?
Actually, this is a kind of a new system that I have set up. So the graphics drivers were not installed. And the problem was that it was trying to compile some 4,000 objects. So I couldn't finish it in time. So I just installed the Intel binaries that were present, thankfully, in the Arch user repository. And then like I couldn't do all the crackings, but I because I am limited by my computational power. So I did 97 of the password one file, and around 50 of the 52 of the password two files actually.
Yeah, that's really great. And I realized actually halfway through Shubham talking that my Zoom decided to switch audio devices, and I think I might have talked over Mainack. So sorry if I did that. And I missed the first bit of what Shubham said, but yeah, it sounds like you got most of the first file and some of the second, which is awesome. Yeah. Did anyone else have any luck cracking passwords?
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I also did it on the first file. So it didn't have like GPU. So I installed that OpenCL, and using the first attack command, I got some of the password. So now I'm trying with the rockU.txt file. It took like quite some time to download the file itself.
Yeah, it's a big file, and yeah, it's
Yeah.
And yeah, just imagine that's 32 million passwords, and some of the files have billions of passwords. So yeah, these files get gigantic, which hopefully gives you some sense of why kind of when we did the neural network, that was so much better
Right.
than just being like downloading a list of common passwords, because those lists would have been gigantic.
Right.
Yeah, but yeah, cool that some of you I expect some of you probably also had all kinds of frustrating experiences with drivers. Yeah, actually, the newest OpenCL was giving me problems on Ubuntu because I haven't actually on my laptop fired up a Hashcat in a bit. But yeah, so I think maybe if anyone else would anyone else want to share? I'm sharing that Rocky used to come pre-downloaded in Kali Linux, which is true. Yeah, I mean Rocky is old now. I mean, yeah, kind of people.
Yeah, I just run it with RockU. So I see that for the first file, a lot of passwords can be cracked using the RockU.
Yeah, common passwords end up being common across lots of different sites. Sometimes because it's the same user, and sometimes just because people pick the same things.
Yeah, actually it recovered 102 out of 300 using RockU.
Awesome. Yeah. So yeah, hopefully others got a chance to do some cracking as well. But yeah, I think wanted to wrap up here right on schedule. But I want to thank Mainack and co-organizers for having me do a tutorial. And hopefully you learned something about authentication, got to appreciate kind of the different aspects of it, everything from system security to kind of cryptography, applied cryptography, to kind of human-centered design and user-centered design, and how all these things really work together to design authentication systems that make sense in practice. And got to think a little bit about kind of research journey and passwords, as well as kind of where we're moving as a kind of computer security community. So I don't know, Mainack, do you have any kind of final thoughts to wrap up?
No, so Yes, thanks, Blaze, for this fantastic tutorial. And I believe that the participants enjoyed it. And while trying the password cracking, I believe that they have got a sense of the things that you talked about the patterns in passwords and so on and so forth. So thanks a lot for this fantastic tutorial, and thanks a lot for conducting this tutorial.
Great, thanks for having me. And yeah, see you everyone. Have a good rest of the conference. And congrats for those of you who have papers that you're presenting.
Okay, so that would conclude this session. Thanks a lot for joining. We'll be back tomorrow with more keynotes and more tutorials and paper sessions. Thank you.